computer. Hi, Joe. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Sandy.
Hi. New Year.
Well, it's 7 o'clock and a stickler for schedule, as I am. Oh, Joe K has just joined us. Good evening.
Hey, Joe. Joe K.
Hey.
Terry.
Terry
Hi,
Moore.
everyone.
Well, let's get started. I mean, as we have found, we take up the full hour, so we should engage. And I wanted to some housekeeping first of all. I sent out a couple things besides the notes for tonight, the syllabus, and just to go over that. So we're starting tonight, January 11th, and we're continuing 6 sessions through February 15th. And then we take a break for Lent and then Easter and Passover. And at the suggestion of Leslie, we are continuing our discussion of the Pharisees, session 2, I guess, after Passover, Easter, and I should have gotten the dates. I forgot the dates, but it'll be in April. We'll resume in April and go 6 weeks. That seems to be the magic number for us. Maybe that's the most we can deal with. Six sessions, and then we got to take a break. And fortunately, it's in these sessions, at least the first session, you're going to hear different voices besides Sandy and me. You're probably getting tired of me. Probably not tired of Sandy, but tired of me. And Gary has graciously agreed to facilitate, as has Kaz and Cohen. Ann's not here tonight, but I think the perspectives and the voices from different people will be quite instructive. And of course, everybody else is adding their voices into our discussions as we go along. So everybody's good with that, I hope. I also sent out I think it's an updated contact list. So please, if the information in there is incorrect, please let me know so I can correct it. The genesis of that contact list goes back to the time when we were meeting in person at St. Luke's or Rodef Shalom, and we had some circumstances where, and aren't we glad we're in the nice warm place in our house or our domestic abode, that we're not out traveling tonight on a rather snowy, cold evening. So I think these Zoom meetings are working out extremely well. Anyway, when we were meeting in person, we had some incidents where we had to cancel because it was snowy and people didn't know how to get a hold of everybody. So I think it's moved beyond having to get a hold of somebody because of weather situation, but I think it's helpful to have one's contact information. And if you all agree, then we'll continue to do that. And please let me know if any of the information on there is incorrect.
Welcome, Nina. Welcome, Lindsay. Nice to see you guys.
Oh, there's Nina.
You're muted, Nina. You're muted.
Well, we're not talking yet, Renee. We're not talking yet.
Okay.
Now you're unmuted.
Okay.
Okay, so we are beginning our study of the Pharisees, a rather daunting, in some respects, daunting book, if size, if nothing else. I think the discussions in there are pretty complex, and we're going to get into that next week. Gary's going to tackle some pretty complex topics right off the bat with, what's in a name, etc. And it's kind of academic in many respects. So I'm trusting that this group, who's very intelligent, can begin to kind of tease apart some of the key aspects of the various chapters. And it is different. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know that we've actually done a edited book with different authors. We've usually done a single author, haven't we?
Uh-huh. We did, there was a little while back, maybe with Paul or somebody, that there were two. I can't remember.
Well, this isn't unusual, but I'm hoping it'll be helpful and instructive, having different viewpoints on the topic of the Pharisees. So I decided it would be helpful to tackle the initial preface of the book. As we've seen, Gary will take on chapter 1, which is the prelude, next week, and chapter 2. But I thought there was some interesting points to be made in the preface, and that's what I thought it would be good to lead off with. I don't know how long this discussion will go. If we get done before 8 o'clock, hallelujah. If not, I'm confident you guys will have ample opportunity to expound upon certain concepts in that preface. So the book, by the way, so the book is edited by Joseph Sievers, who is a German Catholic priest, and Amy Jill Levine, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who we have studied before. And she is a professor she's got various titles at Vanderbilt University. And where's Vanderbilt? I forgot. It's in Tennessee or Kentucky?
Tennessee.
Tennessee. Okay. Very well known, but she's an American Jewish author, and as we will see, was one of the first persons to be invited to participate in this. So the preface begins with the purpose of the book, and it starts with the different perspectives, Christian, Jewish. So the Christian perspective of Pharisees have historically portrayed the Pharisees as legalistic, money-loving, xenophobic hypocrites. And over the centuries, historical critical research has amended and corrected these very toxic stereotypes. Nevertheless, this skewed image, which is drawn from selected passages from the New Testament in the Christian Bible, and it has been exacerbated by anti-Jewish theologies, which emanated in the centuries after the time of Christ. And they continue to infect Christian sermons, Bible studies, and popular culture. So whatever happens in the academic and scholarly arenas, as the authors point out, doesn't often filter down to the individual churches and the various pastors, priests, etc. So you get a continuation, and I don't know this for certain, but I'm guessing it's only it's seen a uptick in recent years with anti-Semitism. And these negative descriptions of the Pharisees bleed over into general anti-Semitic discourse. You know, I was thinking about the Pharisees, and there's another group with a P to their name that I think gets roundly criticized as well. Anybody guess what those might be? Those might be similar time period. Well, maybe a little earlier than that. The Philistines. So, in your mind, what is a Philistine? What image does a Philistine evoke?
What's his name? Goliath?
To me, it means a beer guzzling lout. You know, a guy sitting in front of the TV and without culture, acultural, someone without culture is a Philistine. But as we have learned, archaeology has learned, and I personally know, our image, our understanding of who the Philistines are has been broadly expanded, and they were actually very cultured, and they actually drank wine instead of beer. Well, some of them drank beer, but you know, anyway. So the Philistines weren't put in quite the same negative light as the Pharisees, but I just see that characterization of these different groups through history is unfair characterization of history through history.
Isn't the word Philistine sometimes used unkindly to apply to people that are not liked or not good?
Yeah, not so much not good as just uncultured.
Okay, it's pejorative for sure.
Yes, yes, very much so, Lindsay. And
So the dictionary says that a Philistine is a person who is guided by materialism and is usually disdainful of intellectual or artistic values, one uninformed in a special area of knowledge.
Oh,
agreed. Modern interpretation, but I dare say a root cause would have been during the time when the Philistines were the implacable enemies of the Israelites,
yeah.
the Jewish state in the during the Iron Age in particular. They, as you know from the stories of David, David, according to the Bible, and there are extra biblical and archaeological evidence that suggests that they were correct, that they were the foes. And we now have information that those Philistines actually emanated originally from the Aegean area of the world. That's just a side note, and shouldn't get off too much onto the Philistines. We're talking about Pharisees, but I just thought it was interesting that the two P groups have this negative image in modern culture today. Okay, so that's the Christian perspective of the Pharisees. What about the Jewish perspective? In popular Jewish imagination, the Pharisees are respected teachers of Second Temple Judaism. And they are the ones who extended the holiness of the temple beyond the priests to the people. And as I think most of you know, the major sects in the first century CE Israel were, besides the Pharisees, were the Sadducees and the Essenes. The Essenes being the I wanted to say monastic. That's not quite the right word, but they were the ones separated. Although, as we'll see, to be separated is the root word for the Pharisees, right, Gary?
Maybe.
Yeah. Oh, maybe. Yeah. Right. We also have the fourth group, which Josephus refers to as the third way or the fourth way, were the Zealots. And basically, those were the guys that hated the Romans and wanted to kick the Romans out of first century CE Israel. But they insisted on free will along with divine care. And because of their openness to innovation and concern for the Jewish people as a whole, helped the tradition survive the destruction of the temple in 70 CE and came to develop rabbinic Judaism. But I think, as we'll learn, Gary, if I'm not mistaken, in the chapter 2, there's some, not doubt, but some debate over whether that is in fact true. Is that a fair summary or not?
Yeah, that is a fair summary.
Okay, well, and we'll get into that next week. But that traditionally, the Pharisees are held in high esteem from a Jewish perspective, contrary to the Christian perspective. So why, other than just simply Christian versus Jewish? Well, as our authors or our editors or the many authors in the book describe. The problem or the issue comes down to the separation of the academic, the academy, from the synagogue and the church. What is learned in the academic classroom or setting does not always filter down to the seminary or the congregation. And I suspect there may be some who say, well, that's probably a good thing, because, you know, those academic types. Paul, I see your hand up, please.
Yes, and you had mentioned something that was covered a little bit in the definition section that Gary will probably talk about, and that is the concept of the followers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, otherwise described as the sectarians. I think that may or may not be equivalent to the Essenes that were also described as another of the groups who had disdain for the people who remained in Jerusalem and as part of the priestly class. And the the sectarians certainly represent another group that had its certain followers who had their difficulties with the rabbinic and the priesthood. So if you had mentioned it and I missed it in my comings and goings recent in the last few minutes, I apologize, but I think the sectarians or the Essenes did represent that additional group.
They did, and I did mention it, Paul, but I thank you for expanding upon that. And with your comments, I think it highlights the fact that this was a what would be the right word? A tumultuous time. I mean, there were so many threads of beliefs. You had the Sadducees, the priests, the priestly class, who were more in it with the Romans. They didn't want to upset the status quo, because if the Romans got ticked off by whatever was happening, then it was going to be bad for everybody. And the Pharisees, as I think we're beginning to learn, and obviously maybe by the time we're done with the study, we'll know more about, were the party of the people in some respects. And I think we'll find that there was more accord between Jesus and Jesus' followers with the Pharisees than what is seemingly portrayed in the Gospels in the New Testament. And that, in my opinion, seems to be somewhat radical concept. As I learned growing up and still continue here, here was Jesus and his followers, and here were the Pharisees who were hypercritical of what Jesus was doing. But Jesus represented at the time just one of many messianic figures, cults going on at this time. And then you have the Essenes who went off to the Qumran and the Dead Sea, as Paul mentioned, and then of course the Zealots, who wanted nothing to do with any collaborators, with the Romans. And at the root cause of all that is certainly the Romans. They were the guys in charge, and all of this is percolating underneath. Renee.
Was Jesus thought to be Essene? Did I ever hear that somewhere?
There is some thought that he might have been John the Baptizer. John the Baptist there's more evidence to suggest that John the Baptist may have been an Essene. Jesus, maybe.
James as well, wasn't it? James was our brother of Jesus, was very, very vegetarian and very strict.
He may have been, Joe. I don't know that James was. I've never seen anything, and that doesn't mean anything, that James wasn't perhaps associated with the Essenes. But perhaps as brother of Jesus, if Jesus had some affiliations with the Essenes, perhaps James did too. And the scholars of the Gospels, or of Paul and of Acts and of Rabbinic Judaism, Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hellenistic Jewish literature, late Second Temple archaeology of Judea and Galilee, and other related disciplines do not have sufficient conversations with each other. So the misunderstanding or the different aspects or interpretations of the Pharisees and who they might have been, if they in fact existed, are discussions in academic circles, but that again doesn't filter down to the common people, if you will, in the churches and the synagogues. So we have this perpetuation after 2,000 years of these negative stereotypes. I don't know if they're beginning to be overcome today, but I think we see very much anti-Semitic. I don't know if those anti-Semitic groups today talk about the Pharisees, but I'm sure they would, accord negative stereotypes to the Pharisees. So that's kind of the differences, the Jewish and the Christian perspectives on the Pharisees. And so we're going to dive into the purpose of the volume, but any thoughts at this moment than what has already been expressed? Personal reflections from a Christian or a Jewish perspective on the Pharisees? I'm kind of curious what you all might think, particularly from our Jewish friends, about the Pharisees. Is it something? Are the Pharisees much discussed in the Jewish community?
No. I never heard of them in the many hours I spent in Hebrew school. I think, though it is instructive that even 2,000 years ago, Jews divided up into sects or subgroups, and they do it today. We have Orthodox, we have conservative, we have Reform, we have Reconstructionist, and we have many offshoots from every one of those. And so when you talk about a Jewish point of view or a Jewish perspective, it's very hard to generalize. I mean, there is some commonality, certainly, between all sects or subgroups of Jews, but certainly, for example, what's happening in Israel today is very divisive. There are some who approve and many who don't approve. And we're going to see how all that plays out. And it may have had an impact on the destruction of the Second Temple. And we're concerned about the viability of a Jewish state, given the fact that there is so much division in Israel today about the operation of the state. But it seems to have plagued us throughout history.
To answer your question, I agree with Joe. No, I didn't spend a lot of time learning about the Pharisees. I knew they existed, but it was never key or foremost in my learning or knowledge, but that was just me. So the answer is, I knew of them, but I didn't study them or have any great detail. That's why I find this book and this discussion to be most interesting.
Good. So not only are we controverting the toxic kind of Christian perspectives on the Pharisees, we're also helping to maybe inform our Jewish friends on who these guys were, if they in fact are, as they were portrayed perhaps in the Gospels, in the Christian literature, or in the non-biblical literature. And I don't want to stomp on Gary's stomp on his parade, but we'll get into that next week on who in fact what is the Pharisees, what's in the name, and who were the Pharisees. Well, I think it seems to me important that they are counted as the of rabbinic Judaism, the this continuation of the Sadducees basically evaporated. They were no longer, after the destruction of the temple, there was no reason for them to exist anymore, and they kind of essentially went away, at least what I have understood. And if anybody knows differently, there was no room anymore. There was no temple anymore, so there was no room for priests and the priestly class. The Pharisees, who were more the class, the sect of the people, supposedly then continued and became the founders, the forebears of the what became known as Rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah, I think the question of whether or not the Sadducees disappear is perhaps not as clear cut as right. They may have. I mean, these are not movements. I mean, there's no head of the Sadducees, there's no single head of the Pharisees. These are individuals, right? So Sadducees, for the most part, rejected the idea of an oral law. Now, that doesn't mean they don't interpret the text, right? The same, right? And it may not be a coincidence that about several hundred years after the Sadducees disappear, that another very large movement that rejects the oral law springs up within Judaism, and right, the Karaites, and so whilst they may have disappeared as, I hate the term organized movement or sect, I suspect that that's probably, we're probably putting a definition that may not have been relevant, but this idea of whether or not there's an oral law and how important is it in terms, I don't think it's ever gone away within Judaism, right? So the Karaites spring up, and it could be argued that Reform Judaism of the early part of this century, of last century, is another, step, another rejection of much of the oral law, right? And so this tension about the oral law remains within Judaism, right? Very few people, relatively speaking, break the laws in the Chumash, right? They may not, for the most part, most Jews actually, I suspect, don't work on Shabbos. But they don't rest by the definition of the rabbis either, right? Or the Orthodox rabbinate. So there's always been this underlying tension about the oral law, which I think the Sadducees, basically that was their core, right? That was their core belief. The temple was important, but the temple, that's what the written law is all about. I mean, that's right, about the temple. And you're right, take away the temple and much of that framework disappears. But the idea that the oral law is not the equal or is not given on Sinai and so has equal authority, I'm not sure that hasn't, that just hasn't survived for 2,000 years. And so whilst the movement went away, their ideas didn't go away. Unlike the Essenes, right? The Essenes basically disappear. I don't think any of their, you'll go through the Dead Sea Scrolls, nothing of that seems to appear, bits and pieces, in mysticism, but for the most part, they're, gone with the wind. But the Sadducees, they had a theological principle, which I don't think has ever really evaporated from Judaism, although the Orthodox rabbinate doesn't recognize that. I think.
Well, maybe we should recognize, Gary, with all that, and thank you. Maybe that the threads, the lineage, rabbinic Judaism might be attributable as much to Sadducees as well as the Pharisees. They all blended together, maybe in that post temple period.
Well, no, rabbinic Judaism really, I think, really did buy into the oral law. You see it in the Mishnah, the Talmud, right? That's oral law in action. That's rabbinic Judaism.
Okay.
The Sadducees, I think this, I'm not sure that I just think that things are probably a little more complex. You know, the Gemara talks about the people. They call them the Am Haaretz. If you have you can look it up in a dictionary. Am Haaretz means people of the land, but it basically means dirt farmers, ignorant, unlearned. Right? That's
Philistine.
Yeah, Philistines, right? You know, but without the religious and cultural connotation, and I mean that's what they used to call people in yeshiva. It's an Am Haaretz, it's just if there's somebody, and so again, these things are fairly complex. I'm not too sure. The Pharisees probably were closer to the people, but not the people in the woods, out in the farms. We shouldn't, that transitional period, in other words, is really complex. But I don't think this, and the Sadducees may have disappeared as a class, but the principles that or the theological principles that they represented, which is the questioning the oral laws, biblical oral laws, Sinaitic credentials, never goes away in Judaism. It always percolates, and we see it today.
Thank you, Gary. Anne and then Paul.
Oh, I have a question about the oral law. Would you say that kashrut is oral law? For example, it doesn't say in the Bible, had 2 sets of dishes and blah, 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 blah. It doesn't say all that.
Right.
It just says don't make, and then the rabbis interpreted it this way. And we have all kinds of rules now. But that's not in the Torah. Is that oral law? That's what, when you mention the word oral law, I'm just asking, what the words mean. Is that what you mean by oral law?
Yeah, yes, to a very large degree, right? So the idea of ritual slaughter is not oral law.
A ritual what?
Ritual slaughter, ritual animal slaughter, right?
Ritual slaughter.
That is not oral law.
No, that's in the Bible. That's in the Bible. You cut the certain part of
that's implied, but more importantly, they did that the death of an animal has a religious connotation.
Yes,
is written, and that's why the Essenes were vegetarians, right? It's not because the Essenes had some ethical desire to be vegetarians. The Essenes are vegetarians because the temple was controlled by people they didn't recognize as basically people with the authority to control the temple, and you couldn't have ritual slaughter then, and so the Essenes became vegetarians by default, right? Not because like people today become vegetarians because they value the life of an animal. That's now I may have missed it, but I don't think I've seen any evidence of that in any of their writings, right? It's because they couldn't have a ritual slaughter, so that, but they did having, forget 2 sets of dishes, but waiting 3 hours or 6 hours or 1 hour, that's oral law. Right?
That's oral. Okay, thank you. I
oral law.
wanted to clarify, because I'm a Reformed Jew, and that's what we don't do.
Right.
So thank you. Thank you for clarifying that for me.
No worries. I'm sorry, Gordon. I've taken everyone off on a
Well, then you have plenty of opportunity to get into that next week, won't you, Gary? Paul and then Joe.
Sure. I just briefly like to go ahead and think to the Christian community here. What is it that they see as the failings of the Pharisees vis-a-vis Judaism and Jesus? I'm sorry, vis-a-vis Jesus. What is it that the Christian community accuses the Pharisees of doing that was so abhorrent to Jesus and his followers? Is that way too in the future to go ahead and talk about tonight? But I'm just curious about that particular startup.
Sandy, you got your hands up.
I'm gonna stick my neck out and I'll probably get my head cut off. But my theory about that is, this is Sandy's theory, that Jesus was so much like the Pharisees in his own beliefs that he expected a lot more of those people. Now, Jerry, I don't know if what you think about that, and Nina, but it seems to me that his expectations were so great because he went along with a whole lot of their beliefs, and so that happens in our culture too. We're hardest on the ones that we expect a lot more of. So that's my theory. Has anybody got any backup for that theory? But Jesus did have a lot of agreement with the Pharisees in his own belief structure, and he was adventurous too. He went beyond a lot of the Pharisees, but the Pharisees were pretty adventurous themselves during that era. So maybe that was the attitude of the era.
And I think, Paul, we're going to learn. Thank you, Sandy. I think we're going to learn more about where that differences and where those agreements lie between Jesus and the larger class of, not ruling class, but theological class at the time. Joe, and then Jerry.
Yeah, pardon my ignorance, but I was surprised reading the introduction, and it's my ignorance of the evolution of Judaism that I didn't realize rabbinic Judaism didn't really exist at the time of Christ, before the destruction of the Second Temple. And so I'm wondering if our colleagues can describe the differences between the priests of the time of Jesus in the synagogues versus rabbinics or rabbis. And I guess part of my misunderstanding came from, in our New Testaments, the translations have a lot of people referring to Jesus as rabbi. So I always thought that that was a common title and rabbi teacher predating Jesus. So I guess I must be I must have misunderstood that.
Jerry or Gary, or anybody Jewish or our Jewish friends want to field that question? Oh, Terry, please.
Well, I was just talking about this with somebody else today, and he said that it was rabbi. When I thought of rabbi, I thought it was an actual rabbi too, but he said it was just known as teacher.
Sure.
It meant teacher.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that there were synagogues before the destruction of the temple, archaeologically, as well as in texts such as in the Christian Bible and elsewhere. That's known. There is, however, no evidence that there was any praying in the synagogue. They read the law, but there's no clear evidence, certainly in the land of Israel, that anybody ever actually had an organized prayer service. Right? Most, at least the dedications I'm aware of that have been found, tend to imply that, regardless of who funded it, a priest was actually somehow a central figure in the synagogue. Right? That there's no congregational rabbi. Most now Gordon may know better than I do, but certainly many of the dedications where it talks about somebody running the place, it's very often a family of priests. It just reflects the religious. Basically, it reflects what the Chumash says, right? It's the Torah talks about priests. Now, as a Levite, I would argue that actually the Levites taught the law, and we should all be, right? And so every synagogue should have its own, pet Levite to teach the law. So although there were synagogues outside of teaching the law, they were probably more like community centers, right? There's evidence that people would sleep in them, that there'd be meals served. They would house people, particularly during temple festivals, right? There's also, and they would teach the law, but it's not the kind of synagogue you have today. It's probably a combination of Jewish community center and sessions like this.
Yeah.
Right?
I would agree, Gary. Jerry?
There are at least two examples in the book of Matthew where Jesus goes to a Pharisee's house and has a meal. So the idea that all interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees is negative is false. It's not true. I have been thumbing through my Bible here, looking for negative interactions between the Pharisees and Jesus. I haven't found one yet. It talks about the elders and the chief priests who were after Jesus prior to his crucifixion. But I haven't found anything where the Pharisees specifically had and that Jesus had an antagonistic view to him. There is one passage of scripture, and I'm trying to find it, and I think it's somewhere in Matthew, where Jesus does call the Pharisees hypocrites, and but I haven't found that passage yet, but I know there is one.
The whitewash.
But there are at least two examples where he did go to their homes and have dinner with the Pharisees.
Yep. And I think the rest of this book, we're going to get into a lot of that discussions about belying some of those preconceptions, that those are, in fact, as you say, Jerry, false. That Jesus, in fact, had more commonality with the Pharisees than differences. I mean, he may have had differences with particular Pharisees, I guess, but there are mentioned Gamaliel, as well as who's the Pharisee buried him?
Wasn't Nicodemus the Pharisee?
Nicodemus, thank you, Nicodemus. Yeah, is spoken of in positive terms.
Yes.
Your hand's still up, Jerry, or okay. So the volume itself, so we kind of this Christian Jewish perspective, why the differences. So there are 27 contributors from 10 countries in this volume, and they have various academic specializations. And the purpose is to challenge assumptions, as we've been talking about, fill in the gaps, make the necessary connections, and yield more trustworthy, reliable results. And the topics are organized in a more or less chronological fashion. So as we will learn next week, we talk about what's in a name and who in fact are the Pharisees, who were they? And the book takes into consideration religious sensibilities and the contributions of popular culture, as we well know today, to correct harmful prejudice. And there are examples in there, not only in the academic and in the churches and synagogues, but in popular culture, arts, and in the arts, as how the Pharisees are portrayed. And there's even one of the chapters is on the Oberammergau festival in Germany. Oberammergau, yes. I've never been to that, but they have attempted in recent years to correct the negative stereotypes of Pharisees, which then, as we've been discussing, leads to general anti-Semitism. But the book arose out of an actual conference that took place. It was called Jesus and the Pharisees, an interdisciplinary reappraisal that took place on May 7th to 9th, 2019. It was organized by Father Joseph Sievers, a German Catholic priest. It was at the recommendation of Rabbi David Rosen of the American Jewish Committee, and it was on the 110th anniversary of the founding of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, known as the Biblicum, in Rome. And among the first to be asked and accepted to contribute to the conference and the volume was Amy Jill Levine. So Father Sievers, beginning with, as I read in there, they started with Jacob Neusner, who we studied last session, Rabbi Jacob Neusner, began to select the topics and take the authors, the participants in that conference, incorporate them into the volume, and then where there were some gaps, they filled in with other authors. Hence the book that we're looking at. So the layout of the discussion. So we have the preface, or the preface that we're talking about tonight. Next week, Gary's going to look at the prelude, chapter 1 and chapter 2. What's in a name and who are the Pharisees? And then I am going to look at chapter 3 into the archaeological affirmations of perhaps the Pharisees. And again, much like what's in a name, the evidence is a little gray, a little murky. And then look at one of the Dead Sea Scrolls in session 4. Sandy will pick up with chapters 5 and 6. And sorry, Sandy, I didn't write down what those each are. But, and then Kaz is going to do chapter, Kaz, what chapter were you going to do? Chapter
13, 18, is that it?
18, yes.
Yeah, chapter 18.
And then finally, Ann Cohen is going to conclude our first session with a look at chapter 13. So that's session 1. And then in session 2, with the individual chapters to be selected, and the facilitators, maybe more of you, would like to lead the discussion on those. So that's kind of the layout of the book and what we're going to be doing. And then finally, I wanted to just jump way to the end of this, which was the address of Pope Francis. And it was to the Pontifical Biblical Institute. So his address was to that conference that took place in 2019. And then his address was then included in this volume. And essentially, his address corroborated, replicated what was stated in the initial preface, that that the Pharisees have been treated rather in a polemical way in the New Testament and in other ancient sources. And the conference is examining the history of scholarly and popular interpretations among both Jews and Christians. And as we've seen, among Christians and secular society, the word Pharisees often means a self-righteous or hypocritical person. But for Jews, the Pharisees are the founders of rabbinical Judaism and their own spiritual forebears. And our interpretation of the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, has fostered a negative image of the Pharisees, often without a concrete basis in the gospel accounts. Kind of something we've been discussing now. Well, Jesus wasn't this adamant foe necessarily of the Pharisees, and may have in fact had more in commonality with them than differences. And over time, this attitude about the Pharisees has then been extended to Jews in general, and the establishment and rise of anti-Semitism over the years. And I know one of the chapters in there is going to be looking at Martin Luther, had a very negative, but he also negative attitude of Jews, but he also had some good things to say, as well as John Calvin in medieval times in Christianity. So Pharisees as served to cast Jews in a negative light. Pharisees as a sect or a component of Judaism, but then extended to the whole of the Jewish people. And St. Paul, Paul was a Pharisee, and he was, as to the law, a Pharisee, and he counted that as important. And as we've been somewhat alluded to tonight, Jesus had numerous discussions with the Pharisees about common concerns. He shared with them a belief in the resurrection from Matthew, and he accepted other aspects of their interpretation of the Torah. And in fact, Jesus and the Pharisees may have had much in common. This is all coming from Pope Francis. And in fact, as we read in the book of Acts, some of the Pharisees actually joined the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. So,
There's Anne.
Sorry?
Anne has something to say.
Yes.
I have a question about that. And I asked Sandy, and she said it was the end times. The Pharisees were Jews, right?
Yes, as was Jesus.
Yes, but so the resurrection hadn't happened yet during this conversation, or had it? I don't know. I asked that before. Jews believing in the resurrection is very strange to me. I don't understand it. And as I say, I asked my daughter, the rabbi, and she said, well, looked like the end times. And there were different, and Sandy's not, there was different mindset then. Then is that what I'm hearing, that was part of a larger belief among people that the world is ending, but what kind of resurrection do they believe in? That's what I don't understand.
Well, and Jerry, I see your hand up in just a moment, but Gary, if I understand correctly, Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection, but the Pharisees did.
So why did the Pharisees, if they were Jews, why did they believe in the resurrection?
Oh, wait.
Not the resurrection. A resurrection.
But they believed in Christ's resurrection? No.
No. A resurrection.
A meaning what? What does that mean? That we will all be resurrected someday?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Paul, Jerry. Sorry.
All right,
There's a prayer in the Amidah, the standing prayer, which alludes to the term Machaye Hametim, which basically indicates who resurrects or who revives the dead.
The Reformed Jews took that out. Let me just say that.
Well, what the Reform did with it is their issue. I'm just saying
No,
that
what I'm saying is it's a theological question. It's interesting to me.
Sure,
That's why I asked. That's all. I'm not to start up with that.
No, but my point is that there was, and somebody who alluded to the fact that it was not the resurrection, but the revival of the dead.
Okay.
Was part of what the rabbinic and the Pharisaic Jews did in fact believe. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, it's included. Yes, thank you very much for clarifying that for me.
All right, Jerry, please.
Yeah, I didn't put my hand up to answer Ann's question, but I'd like to answer Ann's question. The first Christians were Jews. Peter was a Jew. Paul was a Jew. The first Christians were Jews, and they believed that Christ had been resurrected from the dead. That's why they became Christians. That's what a Christian is, somebody that believes that Jesus was divine and that he rose from the dead. And later, Gentiles also were converted and believed in the resurrection and became Christians, but the first Christians were in fact Jews. I raised my hand because I found the chapter, Matthew chapter 23 is a diatribe against the Pharisees. as hypocrites for this, hypocrite for that, hypocrite for that. The whole chapter is a diatribe against, but not just the Pharisees. It says Pharisees and teachers of the law. I'm not sure what that is, but if you're interested in the negative interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees, that's found in Matthew 23. So you can look that up. You can look that up on your phone.
And I
Okay.
think Ann is absolutely right about that.
Thanks, Gary.
Even our gospels anticipated the end of time to come soon, because they were influenced by the Jewish eschatology, and especially Matthew is very much believes in that. So, Ann, you're right about that. And it influenced Paul. Paul felt like the end times were coming, and he had to, by gosh, get out there and tell the Gentiles about God. So that was true. That colors almost all of our scripture. Thank you for that, Ann.
Well, that's all I have for this evening. I can always count upon all of you to really add to the discussion. We've done that, and it's only gonna get greater for the next few weeks. So, any final thoughts this evening?
I wonder if Gary would mind if I give him a ring about Josephus this week.
Feel free. I sent my phone number to Gordon. He can add it to the list.
Oh, great. I'll do that. And what's a good time of day to call you?
Well, it's a 2-hour difference. I don't know. Most evenings, the wife calls it a night, usually at about 9 o'clock out time. It's not
So
the
that's-
easiest to get a hold.
That's
but,
bedtime. Okay, something
yeah.
like right after dinner. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, or about 5. It's usually a good time for me.
5 o'clock. And Joe Kay has a
Yeah,
question,
Joe, but close us out, Joe.
and Jerry does too. We need to
Oh,
hear
his hand's still stuck.
from. Oh, okay.
Go.
So, you had written it down, Gordy, in one other explanation for the Christians' feelings towards the Pharisees was Paul himself. Paul in the Acts was crucifying the Christians, and I don't know if he led to the first Saint Stephen's first martyrdom, but it mentions that he was present and he was going to arrest Christians. So this has created in a lot of people who know Acts the sense that the Pharisees were
Against Jesus.
almost zealots against Christianity and against Jesus. So that also is another thing, in addition to what Jerry said in Matthew, although Matthew was written around that, probably even after Acts, are that there was anger about the treatment by groups of Jews, aka some of the Pharisees, which was after Jesus's time.
Well, you're right. You're right, Joe. Paul was deliberate about going out and capturing and bringing the followers of the way. They weren't known as Christians then. They were known simply as followers of the way, and bringing them back to be tried. And I don't believe they were crucified. They wouldn't have been crucified. That was a Roman thing, but they would have been stoned, and Stephen was stoned. And Paul supposedly was there to hold the coats of the people who stoned him. But then, of course, he had his incident on Damascus, and he became a convert to what became Christianity. Jerry, one final thought?
Yeah, they actually were crucified. A number of the disciples were crucified. They were crucified the same way that Jesus was crucified. Jesus was handed over to the Romans to be crucified by the Jews. And likewise, Peter and a number of the disciples were, at least Peter was crucified. as
But
well.
not by the Jews. He was crucified by the Romans.
Correct? The Jews could not crucify, but they handed over people to the Romans to be crucified, which is what they did to Jesus.
True. Right. So whether the Pharisees were complicit in that activity remains, well, we'll get into that, I think, somewhat. So it's 8 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for thoughts. And we'll see you next week and look forward to Gary's exposition on a little more insight into the Pharisees.
Thank
The
you.
Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you
good
very
week.
much,
Thank you.
folks.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
God's
Stay
peace.
well, everybody. Take care, and thanks, Sandy, for your help here.
You're welcome, Ann. I'm glad you.
Yeah. What I did was I looked up an old email of yours and I found it there.
Oh, good. Okay. keep those little-
So that's what whatever works.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Take care. Stay well, everyone.
And nice to see you, Nan. Nice to-
Yes, nice to see you too. Hi, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Love you, Ann.